Let's dive in. We're in this, well, intense period of global maneuvering, aren't we?
We certainly are. The competition between major powers, it feels like it's defining everything right now.
And for so many nations, the big question isn't just, which side are you on?
No, it's more like, how do you avoid getting caught, maybe even crushed in the middle?
Exactly. What happens when the two biggest players are increasingly at loggerheads and you're not one of them?
That's the puzzle, isn't it? That gravitational pull from the US and China gets stronger, and it puts immense pressure on, well, everyone else.
Yeah, and this tension, it's not just happening in quiet diplomatic rooms.
Not at all. It
No.
filters down into trade, technology, security, even culture. It forces choices, or at least creates some major disruptions.
Which brings us right to the core of our deep dive today.
Right.
We're exploring one potential answer, maybe, to navigating this tricky landscape.
Right. And our source material for this is quite specific. We're looking at a CNBC article from May 30th, 2025.
And this article covers something pretty significant. French President Emmanuel Macron speaking at a major defense forum.
The Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a really high-profile event.
So this isn't just, a report on some speech. It's a window into a specific strategic idea being floated on the world stage.
Absolutely. Our focus is squarely on Macron's call, made right there, for Europe and Asia to forge what he called a new coalition.
And he explicitly framed this as a way to respond to those rising U.S.-China tensions we were just talking about.
Precisely. He sees it as dominating the international order.
Okay, so our mission today, take that CNBC article, break it down. What exactly did Macron propose?
And what's the context? Why does he think this coalition is needed now?
We need to understand the specific worries, the examples of tension, the source highlights that are driving this whole idea.
What's this coalition actually supposed to do on a practical level?
And maybe the most important question for you listening, why does this conversation happening maybe thousands of miles away actually matter for understanding your world?
Yeah, we want to get past the headline, really grasp the strategy, the examples the source gives, and what a proposal like this even means in this era.
All right. So let's start where Macron started at Shangri-La, laying out the premise, the problem, as he sees it.
Okay.
What was the central message he delivered to all those defense ministers and foreign policy folks?
Well, according to the article, it was pretty direct. He urged Europe and Asia to actively join forces.
And the reason?
The reason he gave was pointed: to avoid being caught in that growing rift between the U.S. and China.
Caught. That's a strong word. It sounds like being trapped, squeezed.
Exactly. Damaged by forces bigger than yourself. That's the implication.
It paints this picture of nations not really steering their own ship, but maybe becoming victims of circumstance if they don't, do something proactive.
And he was very clear about the number one risk, as he sees it, facing the world right now.
What did he identify?
The article says he stated quite clearly that the division between the two superpowers is the main risk for everyone.
Not just a regional problem for Europe or for Asia, but a systemic global challenge.
That's right, affecting everyone, everywhere.
And he then took this challenge, this division, this risk of being caught, and said it should actually unite two regions that might seem pretty far apart, Asia and Europe. He argued they have a fundamental common interest here.
And that shared interest, as he defined it, preventing the disintegration of the global order.
Disintegration of the global order. That sounds dramatic.
It is. It suggests a real fear that the whole system, international laws, institutions, alliances, the norms we rely on, is genuinely under threat.
Under pressure from this U.S.-China rivalry, it could fracture, maybe even collapse.
That seems to be the concern he's voicing. And for Macron, both Europe and Asia have a massive stake in making sure that doesn't happen.
So preventing that collapse becomes the shared goal, the common ground for this potential new coalition.
Okay. Now, to really get this proposal, you also need to understand how France sees itself fitting into this whole picture. Macron described it in a complex way.
A balancing act, maybe? Or just complex positioning?
I think deliberately complex is the right way to put it. He said France is, quote, a friend and an ally of the United States.
Right. That U.S. alliance is deep, historical, crucial for European security, especially through NATO.
Of course. But then in the same breath, he said France is also a friend and cooperates with China.
Okay, so acknowledging the reality disagreements, competition with Beijing exists.
Yes, he didn't gloss over that. But he stressed cooperation is also a big part of how France engages with China.
And the key part, perhaps. He said France does all this allied to the U.S., friend, cooperator, competitor with China, while sticking to what he called a demanding approach of our own interests.
Exactly. This isn't about picking teams out of pure loyalty. It's about what works for France. Realpolitik, basically. Assessing the landscape based on French interests.
That focus on a demanding approach of our own interests, even while allied to one power and engaging the other, that feels absolutely central to understanding the French strategy here, maybe the wider European one too.
It's the foundation for that whole idea of being a potential counterweight.
Explain that counterweight idea a bit more.
Well, it's not about choosing Team A or Team B. It's about having enough independent clout influence relationships so you're not just pulled into one orbit or the other.
So you can resist that gravitational pull we mentioned.
Precisely. By positioning France this way, Macron's arguing that Europe, maybe with France playing a key role, can offer another pole, an alternative in a world getting squeezed between Washington and Beijing.
Okay. So he's laid out the problem, this risk of global order breaking down because of the superpower split, and he's laid out France's rather unique positioning.
Right.
What was the specific action he proposed? This is where the new coalition really comes in, right?
Yes. At Shangri-La, in front of all those key Indo-Pacific leaders, he didn't beat around the bush. He made a direct appeal.
What did he say?
He urged them to work toward establishing a new coalition.
A new one. Not just tweaking existing alliances, but building something specifically for this moment.
Exactly. Something distinct. And he was very clear about why it's needed.
What was the purpose he outlined, according to the source?
The goal, he said, was to counter the constraints and side effects that are coming directly from this growing U.S.-China rivalry.
Constraints and side effects.
Yep.
That's a key phrase again. It sounds like he's saying the rivalry itself is actively hurting other countries.
That's the argument. It limits their choices, messes with their economies, maybe even compromises their security.
And Macron's saying, let's band together, Europe and Asia, to push back against those limitations.
Right. And this call for a new coalition, it ties directly into that broader French goal the article mentions, trying to position France, and by extension Europe, as a meaningful counterweight to the two giants.
So by proposing this to an audience in Asia, he's essentially saying, hey, we in Europe get the pressure you're under from the U.S.-China dynamic. Let's work together to navigate it.
Yeah, offering a potential partnership to build up collective strength, maintain some independence. It's a pitch for a third way, maybe, or at least a more robust independent path.
And this wasn't just like a thought bubble in a speech. The article puts it in context. Macron was on a wider regional tour.
That's crucial. He'd already been to Vietnam and Indonesia before Singapore.
So this isn't just theory. It's part of a deliberate, sustained diplomatic push by France into the Indo-Pacific. It shows they're putting effort in.
Absolutely. It signals commitment.
And the source details France's stated goals for this increased engagement. What reasons were given?
Well, first, a very practical one. Bolstering defense cooperation with countries in the region, joint exercises, arms sales, training, that kind of thing.
Okay, defense ties. What else?
Secondly, and this links right back to those constraints and side effects, the source mentions France is worried about becoming collateral damage in the U.S.-China trade war.
The economic angle.
Yeah.
Getting hit by tariffs or supply chain problems that aren't really about France directly.
Exactly. Caught in the economic crossfire. And the article also mentions concerns about continued geopolitical disputes with Beijing.
So the drivers are both economic vulnerability to the rivalry and strategic concerns about China's actions in the region.
Seems so. A mix of both.
And the fact that this tour involved concrete examples of boosting defense cooperation. That's important, right? It's not just talk.
It moves it from rhetoric to reality. The source highlights specific deals or potential deals.
Like what?
Well, in Indonesia, during Macron's visit, they signed a preliminary defense pact with President Prabowo Subianto.
A pact. And did it mention specifics?
Yes, the article points to potential big-ticket purchases being discussed. French Rafale fighter jets and Scorpion submarines.
Wow, okay. Rafales and Scorpions, those are major systems. That signals a deep defense relationship if those go through.
It's a significant commitment, requires long-term partnership for training, maintenance, integration. It shows both France and Indonesia are serious about forging closer defense ties.
And what about Vietnam?
The tour included Vietnam, too. Deals signed there were worth over $10 billion, according to the source.
$10 billion. Across what sectors?
Various things, including Airbus planes, but significantly also defense and other pacts were mentioned.
Okay, so again, defense is a key part of the package, even within a broader economic deal. What do these examples, Indonesia, Vietnam, major defense deals, tell us?
They show France is putting its money where its mouth is, so to speak. They're backing up the strategic talk about engaging in the Indo-Pacific with tangible actions.
They're actively trying to become a serious security partner there.
Yes. And by offering advanced European defense tech, France positions itself and Europe as a real option for nations looking to, well, diversify their suppliers.
Diversify beyond maybe just relying on the U.S. or Russia or China.
Exactly. And that diversification is key for countries trying not to be solely dependent on one major power, which again ties right back to Macron's whole point about not wanting to be caught.
Offering sophisticated weapons is a way to build strategic ties that aren't necessarily locked into those existing superpower blocks.
Precisely. It offers another avenue.
Now, beyond the defense side, Macron also really hammered home the economic impact of all this U.S.-China tension.
Oh, definitely. He issued a pretty stark warning about how this rivalry is hitting economies, particularly in places like Asia and Southeast Asia, but also European economies, too.
He focused on two specific, related problems he sees as really damaging. What were they?
First, he flagged the unpredictability of the new tariff approach. You know, the way tariffs and sanctions are increasingly used as weapons in this economic fight.
And unpredictability is the killer word there, isn't it? Makes it almost impossible for businesses to plan or invest if the rules keep changing based on geopolitics.
Exactly. Disrupts supply chains, creates massive uncertainty.
And the second issue he raised was maybe even more fundamental.
Yes, he talked about the potential end of a rule-based order for trade. That's a huge statement.
Suggesting the whole multilateral system, like the WTO, the idea of predictable rules for everyone, is actually eroding.
That's the fear. If trade becomes just about power plays and leverage, not agreed rules, it fundamentally changes everything for countries that depend on global trade, like many in Europe and Asia. It's destabilizing.
And Macron warned about the direct results of this unpredictability and the potential collapse of the rules-based order. What did he say the consequences would be?
He said they'd hit nations' economies directly, making growth harder, investment tougher, prosperity less certain.
And he connected that economic pain directly to security, didn't he?
He did. He argued that this tough economic environment, these constraints, would also hit their ability to fund their own defense efforts.
Oh, that's a crucial link. If your economy's struggling because of trade wars you didn't start, you have less money to spend on the military you might need in this uncertain world.
Exactly. It shows how economic security and national security are totally intertwined now. You can't really separate them in this context.
So this whole economic dimension, the trade disruption, the threat to the rules, it's a really clear example of what Macron means by those constraints and side effects of the U.S.-China fight.
Yes. It's not abstract. It hits countries' bottom lines and their ability to defend themselves.
Now, to really drive home why this call for coalition might feel urgent now, the source mentions that tensions between the U.S. and China are actually ratcheting up again.
Right. And interestingly, it notes this is happening even though there was apparently a recent tariff thaw on one specific issue.
So even if things cool down slightly in one area, the overall pressure is still increasing elsewhere.
That's what ratcheting up again suggests. The rivalry is fluid, the pressure points shift.
And the article gives specific examples from the source material to show what kinds of actions are fueling this tension, creating these constraints and side effects. What did it mention on the U.S. side? Attributed to the Trump administration, but maybe reflecting broader trends.
One action highlighted was the threat to aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students.
Okay, so moving beyond trade into education, research, talent flow, that creates huge uncertainty for universities, students, research.
Definitely. It signals a wider decoupling effort. Another U.S. action mentioned was restricting the sale of chip design software to China.
Ah, semiconductors, the tech battleground, trying to hinder China's progress in developing advanced chips.
Exactly. It's a very targeted move with big implications, not just for China, but for the whole global tech supply chain.
And the article balanced this by mentioning an action from Beijing's side, too.
Yes, it talked about China keeping a firm grip on rare earths exports to the U.S.
Rare earth, those critical minerals needed for everything from phones to EVs to advanced weapons.
Right. China dominates the processing, so controlling exports gives them leverage. It creates vulnerability for anyone who relies on those minerals, pushing them to find alternative sources. Another side effect.
So looking at these examples together, student visas, chip software, rare earths, what does it tell us?
It shows just how broad this competition is. It's not just military posturing or trade figures. It's technology, resources, education, the movement of people. These are tangible ways the rivalry creates real problems and strategic headaches for other nations.
They are the constraints and side effects Macron keeps talking about.
Precisely.
Okay, shifting back to the security angle. Macron argued Europe and Asia need to beef up defense. Against what specifically?
He aimed it at what he called revisionist countries, those seeking to control areas.
Revisionist.
Yeah.
In international relations talk, that means states trying to change the existing order or borders, often by force.
That's the idea. States unhappy with the status quo and actively working to overturn it.
And he didn't just leave it abstract. He pointed to specific places he sees as targets of these revisionist efforts. Where
he mentioned the fringe of Europe.
Which sounds like a clear reference to Ukraine and Russia's actions there.
Unmistakably, the challenge of protecting borders and sovereignty in Europe against aggression.
And then he directly connected that to Asia.
Yes, he named the archipelagos in the South China Sea as another key area facing similar pressures from countries seeking control.
So, linking the security challenges across continents.
And he made that link even sharper, more provocative, with the specific question he posed at Shangri-La. The article highlights it.
What was the question?
He asked the leaders there, and this is cited directly, if we consider that Russia could be allowed to take a part of the territory of Ukraine without any restriction, without any constraint, without any reaction of the global order, how would you phrase what could happen in Taiwan?
Wow.
And he continued, what will you do the day something happened in the Philippines?
That's a powerful parallel he's drawing, linking Ukraine directly to potential scenarios involving Taiwan or the Philippines.
It's very deliberate. He's arguing these aren't isolated problems. If the international community lets aggression and border changes succeed in one place without a strong response,
it could encourage similar actions elsewhere?
That's the implication. It reinforces his point about global security being interconnected and why Europe and Asia share an interest in upholding that global order. If the rules break down in Europe, the risk goes up in Asia and vice versa.
It's a call to see these challenges as linked by the fundamental principle of sovereignty and international law.
Now, since he specifically named the South China Sea and Taiwan as prime examples driving this need for defense and collective action, maybe we should dig into how the source describes the situation in those two spots.
Good idea. They are definitely two of the hottest flashpoints right now. Let's start with the South China Sea. The source notes China's huge claim there, almost all of the South China Sea.
A claim contested by many neighbors, of course. Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan all have overlapping claims based on international law, like exclusive economic zones.
And the source mentions that big 2016 ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague.
Yes, the landmark decision that said China's claim had no basis under international law. Pretty clear language.
But China's response, according to the article,
a refusal to recognize the outcome, just dismissed it, which naturally adds to the instability and lack of resolution.
The article then highlights the ongoing tension with a specific example involving the Philippines.
Right, the standoff over disputed islands and reefs. And it gives us really incredible detail about how the Philippines is maintaining its presence in one particular spot.
Yeah, this part stood out. Manila sending supply missions to a small group of troops.
Who are living aboard an old warship that was deliberately run aground back in 1999.
Deliberately run aground to protect its maritime claims, the article says.
I mean, just picture that. Troops stationed on a rusting, deliberately sunk ship on some remote reef, just to fly the flag and assert a claim. It's incredibly vivid.
It really cuts through the diplomatic jargon, doesn't it? Shows the raw, persistent, almost desperate nature of these disputes on the water.
And it highlights the lengths countries are going to push back against China's claims and actions, like building and militarizing artificial islands.
A powerful symbol of the tension. Okay, then there's Taiwan. The source details that issue too.
China claiming Taiwan as its own territory, a province that must be reunified, using force if needed.
And the source says Beijing has been flexing its military muscle more and more.
Yeah, sending lots of aircraft, naval vessels near, or even surrounding the democratically governed island regularly.
These constant military drills and incursions, they feel like pressure tactics, right? Intimidation.
That's how they're widely interpreted. Demonstrating capability and intent, trying to deter Taiwan and any outside support, it keeps tensions simmering constantly in the Taiwan Strait.
The source also gives a little insight into China's posture at the Shangri-La summit itself this year.
Right. It notes that China's defense minister, Dong Jun, wasn't there. They sent a lower-level delegation instead.
Which the article contrasts with last year's summit.
Exactly. Last year, the defense minister was there and delivered a very strong message, particularly on Taiwan. The source recalls that warning.
What was the warning?
He said, quite bluntly, that any forces trying to separate Taiwan from China would face self-destruction.
Self-destruction, strong words.
Very. And he also stressed just how central Taiwan is to Beijing, calling it the core of our core interest. That language really underscores its importance in China's strategic view and its stated red lines.
So all these details, from the source of the South China Sea disputes, that grounded ship story, the military flights around Taiwan, China's explicit warnings, they provide the concrete backdrop for Macron's argument.
They illustrate the risks he's pointing to, the challenges to the global order, and why he thinks Europe and Asia need to cooperate more closely on defense and resilience.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive. We've unpacked Macron's big call for a Europe-Asia coalition, rooted in that CNBC article from the Shangri-La Dialogue.
We've looked at the context he presented, that intense U.S.-China tension, the perceived risk to the global order.
We explored the economic worries, unpredictable trade, the potential end of the rule-based system, and the strategic drivers, like avoiding collateral damage and pushing back against revisionist actions.
And we dug into those specific, sometimes really striking, examples the source used to illustrate the tensions, the trade actions, the tech restrictions, the rare earths issue, and of course the very real standoffs in the South China Sea and around Taiwan.
And the core proposal, as laid out in the source, is this new coalition between Europe and Asia.
Its purpose: to collectively counter those constraints and side effects of the superpower rivalry.
And by doing that, strengthen the effort to stop that disintegration of the global order that both continents rely on.
It's a strategic idea, clearly born from a feeling that the current global setup isn't quite working, and navigating this polarized world needs new thinking, new partnerships.
So here's a final thought, drawing directly from everything we've just discussed from the source. Given all those specific tensions, the economic pressures, the tech fights, the military flashpoints like the South China Sea and Taiwan, plus the fact that all these European and Asian countries have their own complex ties to both the U.S. and China. What do you think might be the biggest practical hurdles, the real-world challenges for Europe and Asia in actually building and sustaining the kind of new coalition Macron is talking about? What makes it easier said than done?
That really is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The source lays out a strong why, but the how? Well, that involves weaving together dozens of countries across two continents, all with different histories, threat perceptions, economic ties. It's incredibly complex.
Or maybe, let's flip that slightly. What does the picture painted by this source material suggest are the main things pulling nations away from this kind of broad coalition? What forces might be keeping them closer to one of the existing superpower orbits, even with those risks of being caught?
Thinking about those forces pulling apart might be just as crucial as thinking about the idea pulling them together.
Absolutely. Definitely something to mull over as we all try to make sense of this shifting global landscape based on the details we've unpacked today.